It was one of those mornings where the sky seemed to mirror the mood of the city, gray, heavy, and uninviting. The streets of downtown Detroit were slick with rain, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights as people hurried past, heads down, trying to escape the cold bite of the wind. Among them was a man who didn't seem in much of a hurry. He stood near the steps of the courthouse, his worn-out jacket pulled tightly around him, shielding him from both the weather and the world. His name was Jimmy Holloway, though most people passing by wouldn't have known that. To them, he was just another faceless figure, a homeless man holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." His hair was speckled with gray, his face lined with years of hardship. But there was something about his eyes. They carried a quiet dignity, like they'd seen too much but refused to break under the weight of it all. Jimmy had been standing there for hours, not asking loudly, not demanding attention, just waiting for someone to notice him, even if only for a moment. Some tossed coins into his cup, others walked by without a second glance. But then, something changed. A police cruiser slowed to a stop nearby, its red and blue lights flashing softly. In the drizzle, two officers stepped out, their boots splashing through puddles as they approached him. "Sir," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you're going to need to come with us." Jimmy blinked, confused. "What did I do?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "We've had complaints about soliciting near this area," the officer explained. "It's against city ordinance." "I wasn't bothering anyone," Jimmy protested gently, shaking his head. "Just standing here." The officers exchanged a glance. They weren't cruel men, but rules were rules. One of them gestured toward the car. "Come on, sir, let's get this sorted out." Reluctantly, Jimmy gathered his things, a tattered backpack and the small paper cup filled with loose change, and climbed into the back seat of the cruiser. As the car pulled away, he stared out the window at the city blurring past, wondering how his life had brought him to this point. At the station, the process was routine: fingerprints taken, mugshot snapped, paperwork shuffled. To the system, Jimmy was just another case number, another name added to the endless list of minor infractions. No one stopped to ask why a man who wore the scars of service on his body now found himself sleeping on park benches and eating meals handed out by strangers. No one cared enough to dig deeper, but Jimmy didn't resist. He answered questions when asked, signed forms when told, and waited patiently while the gears of bureaucracy turned. There was a strange calmness about him, almost as if he'd grown used to being invisible. Maybe he had. After all, invisibility had become a kind of survival mechanism over the years. As he sat in the holding cell later that evening, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, memories began to surface. Memories of a time when his uniform fit snugly, when he marched alongside comrades who called him captain. Memories of battles fought not just overseas but also within himself after coming home. And memories of her, his late wife, whose smile could light up even the darkest days. She was gone now, taken too soon by illness, leaving Jimmy adrift in a world that felt more foreign with each passing year. The house they'd shared slipped away when medical bills piled up and his disability checks barely covered food, let alone rent. Before long, he found himself living out of a duffel bag, moving from shelter to shelter, always searching for stability that never came. Back in the present, Jimmy sighed deeply, leaning his head against the cold metal bars. Tomorrow, he'd go before a judge, probably receive a slap on the wrist or a warning and be sent back onto the streets. It was a cycle he knew well, one that felt impossible to escape. Yet despite everything, the loss, the loneliness, the constant struggle, he still held on to a sliver of hope. Hope that maybe, someday, someone would see him for more than just a statistic, more than just another forgotten soul. The next morning, Jimmy was led into a bustling courtroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee. The room buzzed with the low hum of murmured conversations, shuffling papers, and the occasional sharp clack of heels on the tiled floor. It was clear this wasn't a place built for storytelling or compassion. It was a factory, churning through cases as quickly as possible. People came and went, their problems reduced to brief exchanges between lawyers, judges, and clerks. Jimmy felt small here, insignificant, like a single drop in an ocean of legal jargon and indifference. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back, flanked by other defendants waiting their turn. His public defender, a young man with tired eyes and a rumpled suit, barely glanced at him before flipping open a file folder. "You're up soon," he muttered without looking up. "Just stick to what we talked about earlier, okay?" Jimmy nodded, though they hadn't really talked much at all. In fact, their entire interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes. A quick rundown of the charges, and a reminder not to say anything unnecessary. Jimmy didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that expecting help from others often led to disappointment. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that no one in this room truly understood who he was or what had brought him here. Finally, the bailiff called his name. "James Holloway!" The voice echoed through the chamber, cutting through the noise, like a knife. Jimmy stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting so long, and shuffled toward the front of the room. As he approached the judge's bench, he caught glimpses of the faces around him, some curious, some bored, none particularly invested in what happened next. Judge Langston sat high above everyone else, her expression stern but fair. She adjusted her glasses and scanned the documents in front of her, her pen poised over a notepad. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her tone clipped and professional. "You've been charged with violating city ordinances regarding solicitation. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Jimmy replied softly, his voice barely audible, over the ambient noise of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed tie, stood to address the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant was observed panhandling in close proximity to a business establishment, which is prohibited under municipal code. Witnesses reported repeated attempts to solicit money despite being asked to stop." Jimmy frowned, slightly shaking his head. "I wasn't bothering anyone," he said, his voice firmer now. "I was just asking for help." The prosecutor ignored him, continuing his argument. "This behavior creates a nuisance and disrupts public order. We request appropriate penalties to deter future violations." Jimmy's attorney rose hesitantly, clearly unprepared for anything beyond the basics. "Your Honor, my client has no prior convictions and poses no threat to the community. This appears to be an isolated incident, and I urge leniency in sentencing." The judge listened silently, her gaze flickering between the two sides. Then she turned to Jimmy. "Is there anything you'd like to add, Mr. Holloway?" For a moment, Jimmy hesitated. He wasn't used to having a platform, let alone speaking in front of a crowd. But something inside him stirred, a desire to explain, to make them see him as more than just a label. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," he started, his words slow but steady. "But I'm not trying to break laws or bother people. I'm just trying to survive. My benefits got messed up and I can't find work because of my health. I didn't know where else to turn." His voice cracked slightly and he paused, swallowing hard. "I served this country once. I gave everything I had, and now—" He trailed off, glancing down at his worn shoes. "Now I don't even have a home to go back to." A hush fell over the courtroom. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Even the judge seemed taken aback, her usual stoic demeanor faltering ever so slightly. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Let's proceed." As Jimmy returned to his seat, he couldn't tell whether his words had made any difference. The prosecutor resumed his arguments and the defense offered weak counterpoints, but it all felt distant now, like watching a movie unfold without knowing how it would end. Jimmy kept his head down, focusing on the grain of the wooden bench, beneath his fingers trying to block out the noise. Meanwhile, subtle shifts were happening around him. A court clerk leaned over to whisper to a colleague, pointing discreetly at Jimmy. One of the bailiffs furrowed his brow, studying Jimmy intently, as if trying to place him. Even the judge seemed distracted, flipping through the paperwork with renewed interest. Something about Jimmy's story, or perhaps his demeanor, had struck a chord, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Back in his seat, Jimmy noticed the change in energy, but didn't dwell on it. Instead, he thought about the nights, spent sleeping under bridges, the endless lines at soup kitchens, the way strangers averted their eyes whenever he passed by. He wondered if today would be any different. Would they send him back to the streets with nothing more than a warning? Or would they finally see him, not as a nuisance or a problem, but as a person? As the proceedings dragged on, Jimmy allowed himself a small sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone in this room cared enough to listen. The courtroom seemed frozen in time as Judge Langston glanced down at the file again. Her pen hovered over her notepad, but instead of writing, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the name James Holloway had caught her attention. It wasn't just a name, it felt familiar, like an echo from another life. She flipped through the pages more carefully this time, her brow furrowing as though she were piecing together fragments of a puzzle. "Mr. Holloway," she said finally, her voice softer now. "How old are you?" Jimmy straightened up a little, surprised by the question. 58, Your Honor." "And where did you serve?" she asked, her tone curious yet measured. He hesitated for a moment, unsure why she was asking. But then he answered honestly. "Gulf War, ma'am. I was in the Army." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. At first it was faint, a few whispers exchanged between the bailiffs and court clerks. But soon heads turned and people began to whisper openly. One of the bailiffs leaned forward, his face lighting up with recognition. He nudged another officer standing nearby. "Wait a second," he muttered under his breath. "That's Captain Holloway? The guy who saved those soldiers during that sandstorm?" The second bailiff nodded slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to awe. "Yeah, I think so. My cousin served with him back then. Said he was a hero." Word spread quickly, like wildfire igniting dry grass. A young defense attorney sitting at a nearby table whispered urgently into her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed something into her notes app. Even the prosecutor, who moments ago had been arguing for penalties, suddenly looked uneasy, glancing down at his papers as if searching for answers. Judge Langston set the file down gently, her gaze fixed on Jimmy. There was no anger or frustration in her eyes now, only a deep, quiet respect. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "you've been awarded medals for bravery, haven't you?" Jimmy blinked, taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected anyone to care about his past, let alone bring it up here. For years he'd tried to bury those memories, locking them away behind walls of pain and regret, but now they came rushing back unbidden and vivid. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. "I got a few. Bronze Star, Purple Heart." His voice trailed off, as if saying the words aloud made them too real, too heavy to carry. The judge nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what he'd said. Then she turned to address the room. "Does anyone here know the full extent of Mr. Holloway's service record?" she asked, her tone firm but tinged with disbelief that such details weren't already part of the case file. One of the bailiffs raised his hand tentatively. "Your Honor, I can confirm he's a decorated veteran. I remember hearing stories about him when I was in training. He led a rescue mission during a massive sandstorm, saved 3 men who were pinned down under enemy fire. They said he refused to leave until every last one of them was safe." The courtroom fell silent again, the air thick with emotion. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing how wrong they'd been to reduce Jimmy to a stereotype, a homeless man accused of breaking minor laws. Now they saw something else entirely, a man who had once risked everything to protect others, only to find himself abandoned by the very system he'd sworn to defend. Judge Langston leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. She tapped, her pen against the edge of the desk, considering her next move. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but filled with authority. "Court is adjourned for 10 minutes. I need to review some additional information before we proceed." As the gavel struck, the room erupted into hushed conversations. Some people stared openly at Jimmy, their faces etched with guilt or admiration. Others scribbled notes furiously, eager to document what was unfolding. A few even approached him, cautiously offering quiet words of gratitude or apology. Jimmy sat there overwhelmed by the sudden shift in attention. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Behind the scenes, things moved quickly. The bailiff who recognized Jimmy's name called the local Veterans Affairs office, relaying the situation. Within minutes, records confirming Jimmy's military service and the honors he'd received were sent directly to the judge's chambers. Meanwhile, the young public defender scrambled to gather more information, determined not to let this opportunity slip away. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the sterile efficiency of earlier. Now there was a palpable sense of gravity, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Judge Langston entered the room, her demeanor calm but resolute. She took her seat and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "after reviewing the evidence and speaking with relevant authorities, it has become clear that Mr. Holloway's contributions to our nation cannot be overlooked. This is not a case of nuisance or disorderly conduct. It is a failure of our society to honor the sacrifices made by those who have served us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The prosecutor, looking increasingly uncomfortable, nodded in agreement. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "given the circumstances, I would recommend dismissing all charges against Mr. Holloway." The judge nodded solemnly. "So ordered." She turned to Jimmy, her gaze softening. "Mr. Holloway, I apologize for the way you've been treated. You deserve better. We will ensure that resources are made available to assist you moving forward." For the first time that day, Jimmy allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let his emotions overwhelm him. All he could manage was a quiet, heartfelt, "Thank you." As the gavel struck once more, signaling the end of the trial, something remarkable happened. One by one, people in the courtroom rose to their feet. Lawyers, clerks, jurors, even the officers who had arrested Jimmy earlier, all stood in silent tribute. It started with a few individuals, but soon the entire room was on its feet, applauding softly, paying homage to a man whose courage and sacrifice had gone unrecognized for far too long. The applause in the courtroom felt surreal, like something out of a movie Jimmy would never have imagined starring in. He stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around at the sea of faces, some smiling, some nodding respectfully, others wiping away tears. It was overwhelming, to say the least. For years he'd been invisible, just another shadow on the streets. Now suddenly everyone seemed to see him. Judge Langston gestured for him to step forward. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice kind but firm, "this isn't over yet. You've been failed by the system, and it's our responsibility to make things right. Please take a seat." Jimmy hesitated, then shuffled toward the witness stand, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The judge motioned for the bailiff to bring him a chair, which they placed near the bench. As Jimmy sat down, he noticed the prosecutor quietly slipping out of the room. Leaving behind only the faint scent of cologne, the young public defender lingered nearby, scribbling furiously in her notebook, clearly realizing this case had turned into something far bigger than anyone anticipated. "Let's start from the beginning," Judge Langston said, leaning forward, slightly. "Tell us about your service, Mr. Holloway. What happened after you came home?" Jimmy swallowed hard, gripping the arms of the chair tightly. Talking about his past wasn't easy. It stirred up memories he'd tried so hard to bury. But something about the judge's tone made him feel safe, like she genuinely wanted to understand. Slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. "I joined the Army when I was 18, he started, his voice low but steady. "It was all I ever wanted, to serve my country. When I got deployed to the Gulf War, I thought I was ready for anything. But nothing could prepare you for what happens out there." He paused, staring at the floor as if reliving every moment. "There was this one night during a sandstorm. We were pinned down, surrounded by enemy fire. 3 of my men were hurt bad, and we couldn't move them without risking more casualties. I knew I had to do something, so I went back for them. One by one, I carried them to safety. By the time it was over, I was pretty banged up myself, but they made it out alive. His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. No one spoke. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her hands hovering above the keys as she listened intently. When I came home, Jimmy continued, his voice cracking slightly. Things weren't the same. I thought I'd left the war behind, but it stayed with me, in my dreams, in my mind. My wife, she tried to help. She was my rock. But then she got sick, and everything fell apart. Medical bills piled up, and before I knew it, I lost the house. After that, it was hard to keep going. Real hard. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, determined not to break down completely. I didn't want to end up on the streets. I didn't ask for any of this. But once you're there, it's like the world forgets you exist. People walk by like you're invisible, like you don't matter anymore. His voice trailed off, and for a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, unexpectedly, someone sniffled. It was the court clerk who'd whispered about Jimmy's name earlier. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, trying to compose herself. Judge Langston leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Holloway. Your courage, both on the battlefield and in life, is undeniable. Unfortunately, it seems the systems meant to support veterans like you have fallen short. She turned to address the room. This is unacceptable. Every single person in this courtroom has a duty to ensure that no veteran is left behind. So let's talk solutions. What resources can we provide to get Mr. Holloway back on his feet? Young public defender stepped forward, clutching a folder filled with hastily gathered notes. Your Honor, I've contacted the local VA office, and they're prepared to offer immediate assistance. Housing options, mental health services, job placement programs. They're ready to help however they can. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. One of the jurors raised their hand timidly, catching the judge's attention. Ma'am, I work for a nonprofit that helps homeless veterans. If Mr. Holloway is willing, we'd be happy to step in and assist him personally. Jimmy's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. Offers poured in from every corner of the courtroom, housing advocates, social workers, even a retired teacher who volunteered to tutor him if he wanted to pursue further education. It was as if the entire room had transformed into a network of support, eager to lift him up after years of neglect. Judge Langston nodded approvingly. Good. Let's coordinate these efforts immediately. Mr. Holloway, you'll leave here today, with a plan in place. This is not charity. It's justice. You earned it. As the details were hashed out, Jimmy sat quietly, overwhelmed by the flood of kindness surrounding him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life. The weight of loneliness that had pressed down on him for so long began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. When the proceedings finally wrapped up, the judge called Jimmy back to the front. Before you go, she said, extending her hand, I want to thank you for your service, for your resilience, and for reminding us all why we're here. Don't lose faith in humanity, Mr. Holloway. There are still good people in this world. Jimmy shook her hand, his grip firm, despite the tremor in his fingers. Thank you, Your Honor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't forget this. As he walked out of the courtroom, flanked by volunteers offering guidance and support, Jimmy felt a warmth spreading through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden beams across the city streets. It felt symbolic, like a new chapter was beginning, not just for Jimmy, but for everyone who had witnessed his story unfold. By the time Jimmy stepped out of the courthouse, the air had changed. The rain had washed away the grime from the streets, leaving behind a fresh scent that mingled with the crisp autumn breeze. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting long shadows across the steps where just hours earlier he'd been arrested for simply asking for help. But now, as he stood there, blinking in the daylight, it felt like an entirely different world. Crowd outside was small but growing. Reporters who had caught wind of the courtroom drama were scrambling to set up cameras and microphones. A local news crew pushed their way to the front, eager to get a statement. Word traveled fast, especially when a story hit such an emotional nerve, and Jimmy's case was already making headlines. For once, the media wasn't chasing scandals or crime stories. They wanted to tell a tale of redemption, resilience, and justice served. One reporter approached cautiously, holding out a microphone. "Sir, can we have a moment of your time? What do you think about what happened today?" Jimmy hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone answering questions under bright lights. But before he could say anything, someone else stepped forward. A middle-aged woman wearing a jacket emblazoned with the logo of a veteran support group. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Take your time," she said softly. "You don't owe them anything right now. This is your moment, not theirs." Her words gave him strength. He turned back to the reporter and nodded slowly. I didn't expect any of this," he admitted, his voice steady despite the whirlwind around him. "All I ever wanted was to be seen, not as a problem, but as a person. And today, for the first time in a long while, I feel like people are finally listening." His answer sent ripples through the crowd. Some reporters jotted notes furiously, while others exchanged glances, clearly moved by his sincerity. Someone shouted another question. "Do you think this will lead to bigger changes for veterans?" Jimmy thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know about that. All I can do is hope. Maybe if my story helps even one other person, it'll be worth it." As the interviews wrapped up, Jimmy climbed into a car provided by the non-profit organization that had offered its services during the trial. They drove him to a temporary housing facility, a modest apartment with clean sheets, a warm bed, and a kitchen stocked with essentials. It wasn't luxurious, but to Jimmy, it might as well have been a palace. He walked inside, running his fingers along the smooth countertops, marveling at the simple comforts most people took for granted. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Representatives from the VA visited him, going over his benefits and helping him navigate the paperwork that had once seemed so overwhelming. Counselors introduced themselves, offering therapy sessions tailored to address his PTSD and grief. Even the nonprofit teacher who had volunteered to tutor him stopped by, bringing books and worksheets to help him brush up on skills he hadn't used in decades. But perhaps the most surprising development came from the community itself. News of Jimmy's story spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Local leaders held town hall meetings to discuss ways to better support veterans and prevent homelessness. Social media lit up with hashtags like Justice for Veterans and Remember Our Heroes, flooding timelines with messages of solidarity and demands for action. People donated money, supplies, and even their time to organizations working to assist struggling veterans. At one of these events, Jimmy found himself standing on a stage looking out at a sea of faces. He hadn't planned to speak, he'd only agreed to attend because the nonprofit organizer insisted. But when the microphone was handed to him, he couldn't refuse. "I never thought I'd stand here today," he began, his voice trembling, slightly. "Not too long ago I was invisible, homeless, forgotten, but something amazing happened. People listened, people cared, and because of that, I'm getting a second chance." He paused, scanning the crowd. Some people nodded encouragingly while others wiped tears from their eyes. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "There are thousands of men and women out there who gave everything for this country, only to come home and find themselves abandoned. We need to fix that, not tomorrow, not next year, but now." The applause that followed was deafening, echoing off the walls of the auditorium. When Jimmy stepped down from the stage, he was greeted with hugs, handshakes, and promises of support. Strangers thanked him for speaking up, telling him his courage had inspired them to take action in their own communities. Back at his new apartment later that night, Jimmy sat by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The weight of the past. Few days pressed down on him, but it wasn't crushing. It was grounding. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream again. Dreams of stability, of purpose, of reconnecting with the world he'd fought so hard to protect. And yet, amidst all the noise and attention, he remained humble. He knew his journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead. Sleepless nights, moments of doubt, battles with the demons that lingered in his mind. But for now, he chose to focus on the good. On the people who had reached out, the doors that had opened, the lives that might change because of what had happened in that courtroom. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Jimmy realized something profound. Justice wasn't just about punishment or fairness. It was about recognition, about acknowledging pain, honoring sacrifice, and refusing to look away. And in that moment, surrounded by the kindness of strangers, he felt truly seen, for the first time in years. Months passed, and Jimmy's life began to take shape in ways he never thought possible. The temporary housing turned into a permanent apartment, a cozy place with sunlight streaming through the windows and walls adorned with photos of his late wife. He'd framed one picture especially, the one where she was laughing so hard her eyes crinkled at the corners. It sat on the small table beside his bed, a reminder of the love that had once anchored him and the reason he kept moving forward. Every morning, Jimmy woke up early, not out of habit, but because he wanted to. For years, waking up meant bracing himself for another day of uncertainty, another battle against hunger and cold. Now, mornings felt different, lighter. He brewed coffee in a shiny new machine someone had gifted him, savoring the rich aroma as it filled the room. Then he'd sit by the window, watching the city come alive, feeling like part of it again instead of an outsider looking in. His days were no longer empty or aimless. With the help of counselors, he attended therapy sessions regularly, slowly unpacking the heavy baggage he'd carried for decades. At first, talking about his pain felt uncomfortable, even embarrassing. But over time, he realized how freeing it was to share his story, not just with strangers, but with people who truly understood what he'd been through. Veterans from the support group became his friends, meeting him for coffee or taking walks together. They swapped stories, laughed about old memories, and sometimes cried when the weight of their shared experiences became too much. In those moments, Jimmy didn't feel alone anymore. The tutoring sessions also made a big difference. At 58, learning felt strange at first, like trying to flex muscles he hadn't used in years. But the retired teacher who volunteered her time was patient and kind, encouraging him every step of the way. She taught him how to use a computer, helped him write emails, and even introduced him to online courses. One day, while browsing through a list of programs, Jimmy stumbled upon something that caught his eye. A mentorship initiative aimed at helping homeless veterans transition back into society. Without hesitation, he signed up. It wasn't long before Jimmy found himself mentoring others, men and women who reminded him of his younger self, broken but determined to rebuild. Sitting across from them, listening to their struggles, he saw flashes of his own journey. He told them about the courtroom, about the judge who had stood up for him, about the strangers who had offered kindness when he least expected it. "You're not invisible," he'd say firmly, leaning forward in his chair. "People see you, and if they don't, we'll make sure they do." Word of Jimmy's work spread quickly, earning him invitations to speak at events across the city. He visited schools, community centers, and town halls, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. His message was simple: no one should be left behind. Every veteran deserved a chance to heal, to thrive, to find purpose after serving their country. Audiences hung on his every word, moved not just by what he said, but by the quiet strength in his voice. In the meantime, his story continued to inspire change beyond Detroit. Local lawmakers drafted bills aimed at improving resources for veterans, ensuring they received timely benefits and access to affordable housing. Nonprofits expanded their outreach efforts, partnering with businesses to create job opportunities, specifically for former service members. Even national media outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on systemic issues that had long been ignored. One evening, Jimmy received an unexpected phone call. It was from the governor's office, inviting him to attend a special ceremony honoring veterans. When he arrived, He was greeted with applause, standing ovations, and tears from people who had followed his journey. As he accepted a plaque engraved with words of gratitude, he couldn't help but think of all the men and women who hadn't gotten the same second chance. Their faces flashed in his mind. The ones he'd served alongside, the ones he'd lost, the ones still struggling silently on the streets. "I'm not here for me," he said during his speech, gripping the podium tightly. "I'm here for them. For everyone who feels forgotten. For everyone who thinks no one cares. I want you to know this. You matter. Your sacrifices matter. And we're going to keep fighting until every single one of you has the support you deserve." The crowd erupted into cheers, many rising to their feet. Among them were familiar faces: the public defender who had represented him, the non-profit volunteers who had rallied around him, and even the bailiff from the courtroom who had whispered his name that fateful day. They smiled at him, nodding, proudly as if to say, "We always knew you could do this." After the event, Jimmy returned home exhausted but fulfilled. He sat on the bench outside the VA hospital where he'd spent countless hours seeking help in the past. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. He thought about how far he'd come, from sleeping under bridges to mentoring others, from being invisible to becoming a symbol of hope. Life hadn't given him an easy road, but it had taught him resilience. It had shown him that even in the darkest times there were glimmers of light, if you were brave enough to look for them. As he opened his eyes and watched the horizon fade into twilight, Jimmy whispered softly to himself, almost like a prayer, "Thank you. Thank you to the people who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Thank you to the system that had finally worked the way it was supposed to. And thank you to the woman whose memory still guided him, reminding him to keep going no matter what. Because sometimes, justice isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering who we owe our freedom to." And Jimmy Holloway, once forgotten, was now unforgettable.